Hi guys. You're probably a bit surprised to see this here. In truth, I am a little as well. The video that I intended for Halloween is only about half finished as of now, but I didn't want to leave you with nothing. I've always posted a video for Halloween, and I didn't want to make an exception, particularly not this year. Then I remembered that I had this half-finished sci-fi horror story lurking in my draft folder. I had intended to use it for one of my milestone videos, but needs must, and it works better for Halloween anyway. Fair warning, I only had 3 days to finish it, so please be gentle. Also, it needs a name. I haven't been able to come up with one myself. Suggestions would be very welcome. I hope you like it. A frozen slough of skin peeled from his hand as it slipped from the icy copper. He struggled like a panicked insect against the insane mechanic wall, clawing with his withered fingers for whatever merciless purchase he could find. His mouth drew in great, rasping gasps of stale, razor-thin air. This was only the first ascent of the day, as he called the times when his eyes were open, and he had set himself 3. 3 days ago he'd managed 2. Yesterday, 1. Below him, the landscape spread outward in a fractured maze of gray metallic splinters, before, at the limits of his failing vision, sweeping upwards again into the endless dark. It had been weeks, as he counted them, since he had seen another living face. The memory repulsed him. The eyes had guttered with the same wasting vitality he knew showed in his own. Reflective surfaces were plentiful in this new world, but he did not need to see himself to know. He could feel his life clutching at him, just as he had clutched at that wall. Soon it would lose its faltering grip and drift away, leaving a broken husk behind. He wondered if, when it finally happened, he would even die. Or would he just exist, alive but not aware, until the cold or hunger shut him down? Little doubt similar thoughts had crossed the other's mind as he had trudged beside him across the frozen steel-pipe plain. In fact, there was no doubt. Not anymore. There was nothing to say. They had both understood, and neither had bothered to speak. Eventually they had simply turned away from one another and, not looking back, trod their own weary paths into the torpid gloom. Adrenaline had removed the pain but left nothing behind. He felt as if he were watching his hands claw his body's dead weight over the lip of the chrome crevasse, before rolling childishly into a small, dark alcove. He thought that, had other eyes observed his lurching form, hair a matted tangle, skeletal frame hidden under a dozen peaty layers of ragged, frost-specked cloth, they might see him as some ancient and battle-worn bear, slowly succumbing to the wounds of a dozen Neolithic spears. Other eyes, he knew, would never see him again. At least, other eyes than the millions of lifeless, scummed-over pools that now stared vacantly across this insane, clockwork purgatory. His purgatory. His masterpiece. By sheer luck, the alcove had been lined with a moldering layer of velvet, and provided the closest to comfort he had experienced since he had left the encampment. His hands tore feverishly at the various crannies of the twisted lattice, seeking out any lost shreds to swathe their freezing fingers. One hand plunged unexpectedly into a pit of cold moisture. He withdrew it to see it slathered in a congealed mess of frosty blood. Reflexively, he shoved his hand into his mouth, sucking away the faded, empty nourishment. Further excavation produced small fragments of flesh, which he also hastily consumed, not bothering to burn them with his lighter. Much like his eyes, his hunger had come to accept the gray, vicious blandness of this reality. The relishes and pleasures of human existence were now as unattainable as the stars that once shone in the sky. He entered sleep as he had once crossed through an open doorway. There was no languid descent from wakefulness. His eyes simply transitioned from sight into dream. a catalogue of broken memories unspooled before him, offering imitations of lost delights, the warmth of the sun, the crackle of color in the spring bloom, laughter. In the old world, dreamers had been disparaged as escaping from reality. In this one, dreams were the only record of what had once been, and now had never been at all. Thus, they were more real than the blasted corpse universe that now surrounded him. And they were fading. Each time he closed his eyes, each flickering remnant of true memory was ever more corrupted by images of this heartlessly monotonous plane. Soon, he knew, those last glittering treasures would fade and twist into gray obscurity, choked flickers from a dying analog signal called the mind. And this reality would be the only one left. It was perhaps in fear of this that his dreamer's eye fixated first on that blinding iridescent orb, the seething mass of fiery iron that was hearth to a gaggle of broken, rickety shacks that huddled devotedly around it. It had been from here, untold awakenings before, that he had departed on what he had called his quest, and others, his friends he thought, had called his death. The elder, his root-like hand grasping his arm with shocking strength, had demanded he remain. His mind was unique, the elder said, a treasure of which he still had more to give, and not to discard into the void. He could only respond by glaring into the elder's still youthful eyes, their blue not clouded by the senescence of despair, as his own were. If he were leaving, he retorted, then it was the elder's fault. He had infected him with hope, spoken, even sung, of better worlds and the continuance of man. How could he hear such things and not want to seek them for himself? Why should the future be as much of a dream as the past? Besides, this haven was an illusion. A year, a century, a millennium from now, whatever now passes for time, that tin sun would die, finally giving out to the frigid, rancid air. Would the elder, or his anointed successor, then proclaim himself Moses and lead his people into the dark? He didn't ask that question, of course. The elder could see his response in his face, just as he could see the elder's in his. In this nation of one, every mind knew every other as it knew its own. Speech had become merely an auxiliary mode of communication, like hand gestures. No one bade him farewell the day he left. Few even glanced at him. Conversation was over. Reflexively, he had glanced upwards toward the other distant glowing orbs, the dull stars of this insane cosmos. For no reason in particular, he chose the closest and struck out in its direction. For the first few days, he had traveled as part of a scattered collection of like-minded souls, their identical hunched silhouettes outlined against the ever-fading light. It was strange, he thought, that they should still look so similar. They had all woken to the nightmare in their own places, and faced their own trials, yet they seemed to have all arrived at the same resolution. Then again, perhaps that wasn't so strange. Until that moment when he had pulled the handle on the copper dais, they had all, more or less, been him. Was it a single digit in the 4D coordinates? A fluctuation he failed to account for? Did his finger simply slip? His mind played the litany of ancient questions again. He no longer cared if they were meant to console or punish him. For whatever reason, he was alive. Alive as trigintillions of him were dead. No, he told himself, don't be stupid. Whatever the number of dead was, it had no name. And they had all deserved it, just as he had. No, he thought, they deserved worse. At least they had once existed. If the law of Babylon held true, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, blood for blood, then they, and he, should never have existed at all, never have had the vision, never reached out beyond the folds of reality and pulled them crashing down, never have existed while a world of color and vitality remained, perfect in their not being. A new day. He didn't begrudge the frost that had sealed him in as he slept. Ice was a good insulator. A fragment of cheek made for breakfast, and while not exactly revived, he felt a welcome absence of pain, likely due to the narcosis of exhaustion. He reflected, as he always did, that the self-loathing he'd indulged in the previous night was entirely pointless. He would never be punished, and he could never atone. Redemption, the elder had said, died with the old world. If heaven ever existed, it was empty now. This was a world of mathematical outcomes, probabilistic fluctuations, and the comfort of uncertainty, a monument to the constructive power of chaos. That he and his fellow selves were alive at all, and not joined with their brethren at the core of the dark heart of this universe, proved that beyond all doubt. If they could survive, then worlds could survive. Galaxies could survive. Perhaps, somewhere, encased in some heavens-spanning iron maw of detritus, even another universe just like his own still abided, its worlds spinning, its stars transmuting, its peoples lusting, mourning, struggling, and crusading, oblivious to the nightmare beyond their horizon. It was a comforting vision, and a logical one, and it wasn't surprising that so many had turned to the elder for something approaching meaning. As he trudged across the steel plain, staring idly into countless duplications of his own frozen, screaming face, he wondered if he could have come up with the idea himself. Probably. After all, the elder was merely him with a 25-year age advantage. Was this so-called quest really born of hope? He knew that it was a virtual mathematical impossibility that he would arrive at one of those passed-over paradises the elder had spoken of, at least not before his almost certainly early death. Perhaps he merely needed a direction to move towards. He had arrived relatively late in the timeline. Many, like the elder, had arrived far earlier, and had long ago drank the dregs of their irrational dreams, preferring to revel in the comfort of possibilities, rather than seek them out. He wondered if the others, now dispersing to the various shadowy alcoves and tributaries that branched off from the rapidly narrowing field, had also arrived late, and felt the same need for a destination, even if it was nowhere. It was then that he saw it. Alone, perched like a glacial deposit on the jagged mechanoid landscape. It was perfect, unblemished. Perhaps it had only just arrived. He tentatively reached out his hand to touch the acrylic sphere, as if he feared it would vanish. It was still warm. It had carried the warmth of the old universe with it into this hell. He ripped open the door and rushed inside before the cold could follow him. Air, full, aromatic, and heady, billowed outward to greet him. He hastily closed the door, trapping the air before the outside could claim it. The scent! He'd forgotten it. Plastic, fresh velvet, and a hint of paint and turpentine. Copper, silver, and gold piping. He'd always had a classical sensibility, and felt a need to pay tribute to H.G. Wells. His hands played giddily over the controls, the now dead holoprojectors encased in wood paneling and gold inlay, the thruster controls with their leather handles, and of course, the great copper lever on the raised dais, like an old-world gearshift. The final command. Let's go. With it, he, and a horde of a trillion others just like him, had, with a cry of triumph, ended the universe. He pushed it again, as if doing so could undo his sin. A flicker of the old guilt returned, but it rapidly faded as days of enervation and malnutrition finally caught up with him. Even though he'd only been awake for 3 hours, for the first time since the end of reality, he fell into a complete and perfect sleep. It had been a bright, sun-dappled day when the vision came to him, though he never remembered it that way anymore. In his mind, the moment when he broke the final seal in our understanding of the universe, was cast in the harsh, pitiless gray of a prison wall. The realization that black holes were not black holes, that they could be shaped and spun into myriad swirling forms, and that those forms, once in motion, could create closed time-like curves, had threatened to create a utopia. The manufacture of a black hole proved surprisingly easy once their true nature was known. The overwhelming majority of the required energy was spent in containment. Their ease of manufacture led to a world intoxicated with the joys of Einstein's twin paradox. Within a decade, travel to the future, provided one had a high-interest bank account, had become a viable alternative to a pension. But that wasn't time travel, of course. It was simply moving slowly. To truly travel through time was to test the limits of causality itself, to see if the universe could withstand being confronted with the idle fancies of millennia of philosophers. It could not. His dream took him back to the final moment of the old world. The great, matte black whirlwind, spiraling into what seemed to be infinite distance, but both was and was not, its edges flashing rotten green as they touched the containing field, shaking the entire facility. It was hideous. It was beautiful. The pod lay suspended in a magnetic clamp, ready to ride the maelstrom to the one place humanity had never gone. He had insisted the first trip should be manned. Some had objected to this, though, in retrospect, it wouldn't have made any difference if they'd sent a baseball. The temporal destination was set. Current time minus 3 minutes. How could a craft be sent from the future into the past? What would the consequences be? Should it not already be there? For many, the possibility of time travel, yet the lack of any observed retroactive consequences, meant that it had to be safe. Clearly, the many-world solution to the grandfather paradox was correct. You cannot change the past, only create an alternate reality, which meant that any consequences would fall in universes other than your own. Others found this a fairly selfish definition of safe, and also raised the question of why their reality had not been burdened with the blunders of other worlds' imprudent time travelers. Perhaps, proponents argued in return, because those realities don't exist until created by the time traveler. Regardless, since the only way to test these concerns was to make the trip, opposition slowly fell away. There was no way to know what would happen. The safety team had insisted he be crash-proofed, even while gnashing their teeth at his utterly non-compliant steampunk affectations. His chair, still velvet, was extended to hold his neck and head, his body mummified in nylon straps. He had anticipated a rush of G-force blood to his feet, or the agony of tidal force beginning the process oh so hilariously called spaghettification, in which a black hole slowly tears you apart along the gravitational gradient. Instead, all he felt was a sudden rush, as if falling from a great height. There was no flash, no sound. One instant, the facility was around him. The next, it was not. His pod had come to rest much as his current one had, and like that one, the instruments were dead. He still had no idea why. He did not immediately register what his eyes were telling him lay beyond the acrylic boundary of his universe. There was simply no frame of reference for what he was looking at. At first, he thought he'd been teleported into some grand alien cathedral. Ragged metallic walls soaring vertiginously upward beyond sight, riddled with great alcoves and tunnels so vast a rocket launch tower could have been wheeled through them. His first realization was that wherever he was never going home. The craft had been expected to simply wait 3 minutes. He sat still for far longer than that. He had no means of measuring time, but he assumed hours must have passed before the musty choke of carbon dioxide in his lungs made him risk everything and open the door. His shoes crunched on the layer of frost, and then made contact with an alarmingly slick surface. He flailed wildly before the pod caught his fall, and then, with mingled terror and curiosity, brushed away the rime to see what he was standing on. For a moment he stared uncomprehendingly, until the shock of hideous recognition nearly made him fall again. It was an identical acrylic pod, and inside, an identical and very dead pilot. He couldn't reach the door, but that didn't matter. Just inches away was another identical pod, and another, and another. Some were fused vilely together, as if they'd appeared inside each other. Some were mangled beyond recognition. In some, the pilots were frozen to their seats in resignation. In others, they lay stretched, half inside the pod, half outside, their bodies covered in frozen wounds, their faces contorted into frozen screams. And they were all him. Every single one. Over and over and over. Every detail of their appearance, every trinket they've carried with them, every stray hair on their horrified faces. They unfolded outward, seemingly forever, in a cosmic graveyard of himself. Whatever else he may have been, bringer of the apocalypse, eraser of history, architect of the single grandest monument to his own hubris in all of reality, he was still a scientist, and the reason for this monstrosity's existence came to him quickly. Like many disasters, it was simple in retrospect. The many worlds hypothesis held that for every event in the universe, another universe must exist in which that same event played out differently. A fleck of dust catching the light at a precise moment, a molecule in a breath of air striking a wall at a precise angle, an electron jumping to another level in a hydrogen atom in a galaxy a billion light-years away. How many, in absolute terms, are created every minute, every second, every trillionth of a second? The number was beyond imagination. Each an entire universe. Galaxies, stars, lives, histories, all created again and again for the sake of a particle in an atom. But the creation is not symmetrical. By definition, all new universes must diverge from a single specific event, sprouting like a bush from a kernel in the ground. Trillions and trillions and trillions of universes, each spawning trillions of their own, all traced back to a single point in space and time. When he had pulled the copper lever on that dais, uncountable identical alternates, all created in the previous 3 minutes, also pulled that lever, and all traveled back to the same point. Or most of them did. Somewhere, he assumed, beyond where the farthest galaxies once were, there was a black hole, or at least what used to be called a black hole, likely larger than the visible universe, comprising all of those travelers who had punched the right buttons and arrived at their destination. But for every vigintillion who did, a smaller number must have erred, or perhaps been blown off course by whatever eldritch forces govern the realm beyond time. Some arrived a day earlier, some at the Big Bang. Some stayed put. Others were flung to the far ends of the universe. He had overwritten all of cosmology with himself. This was a universe governed by the rules he had inadvertently written. The only air was the air brought in the pods. The only warmth and light was from those pods that had fused together sufficiently and in enough quantity to retain heat. The only open space was that allowed by the fluctuations of probability. And of course, the only food was, well, familiar, if abundant. He was truly king of all he surveyed. His eyes slowly opened. The first pangs of cold were nagging at his extremities, but for the moment he held the nightmare at bay. For once, his dreams had been of this place, while he had awakened in his own world, or at least a fading fragment of it. Unfamiliar comfort and the nectar of nostalgia had stayed his realization until now. This pod was not identical to the innumerable others that made up his world. His mind scrambled to listen to what his intuition was telling him. Of course, when he knew, it was obvious. The pod was empty. There was no one in it, No bewildered doppelganger to drag screaming into his junkyard universe. Logic suggested that some of the probes at least must have been unmanned. But if so, why had the interior been kept? Had he backed out at the last minute? Perhaps it had launched early. A breathless smile spread across his face. This pod was something he had not seen in all the miles he had miserably trudged across endless fields of his own corpse. A mystery. His eyes darted excitedly across the tiny space, looking for anything out of place. He knew every component in every corner. He could see each one in his head. What here was different? His fingers traced every hidden crevice before settling on something he didn't recognize. It was a plastic box, about 2 cubic meters in volume, and noticeably heavy. For a brief moment he pondered if he should open it, before remembering that consequences were for other realities. He flipped open the box. His jaw fell limp. Inside was a pure crystal globe, not unlike a snow globe, and within that, the familiar, writhing, matte-black form caged in flashes of green. Only, rather than a whirlpool spiral, the thing shaped itself into a kaleidoscope of imploding and exploding forms, seemingly infinite in its variations. He knew what it was, what it had to be. Somehow, at least one of his other selves had understood the fate awaiting reality at the end of that black spiral, and made the only choice he could. The twisting entity in his hand told its own story. Black holes were not black holes. They were gateways, paths to other universes, and if you shaped one in just the right way, you could use it as an anchor to draw another universe to your own. 2 universes in collision lead to only one outcome: annihilation, and then creation. Cosmos reduced to energy, energy birthing matter, matter birthing life, and life, perhaps, one day, birthing mind. There was nothing else in the box. No letter, no instructions. There didn't need to be. Language was only an auxiliary form of communication. The device could not unseal itself. Someone had to choose. He took the globe in his hands and rotated it until it clicked. For the first time in this universe, a new sound could be heard, like distant rushing wind, or the hooves of horses. He daintily placed the object in the seat beside him, though in truth it wouldn't have mattered if he dropped it on the floor. What he had set in motion was now unstoppable. The sound grew louder. He wondered, would humanity have a place in this next world? Then he decided he didn't care. He would let other gods deal with that.